Hi, Jessica here. Just a quick note before we begin. This episode came out before Reimagining the Workplace became the ReImagination Café. Same spirit, same heart, just a new name that better reflects how we've evolved. Hello and welcome to the Reimagining the Workplace podcast. I'm Jessica Cherry. So the first time my father asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, setting aside for the moment whether that's a question we should be asking our kids, I said either an actor or a professional horseback rider, to which my father responded, 1 in 10,000 makes it as an actor, kid. You'd better come up with something else. And you can't make a living as a professional horseback rider. That was disappointing. And clearly I had not given him the correct answer. So a few years later, when he asked the question again, this time I was ready for him. A lawyer, I exclaimed. A response that was met with the smiles and nods I so deeply desired, and I beamed with pride. When my sister whispered in my ear, "You don't want to be a lawyer, why did you say that?" I replied, because it makes Dad happy. Now, I loved my father, and of course I had free will regarding my career choices. And while yes, I did eventually become a lawyer, I don't share that story to criticize my father or to suggest that becoming a lawyer was a bad decision. I share it because most people I know loved being creative and engaging in art when they were kids. Whether it was painting, acting, music, working with clay, dancing, or even just doing things in completely new and different ways. It made them feel good, it energized them, it reduced stress and anxiety, and it was fun. But at some point along the way, many got the memo that it was time to grow up, to become a professional. And creativity and art, while all very well and good, were just not part of that. But what if they were? What would a workplace culture infused with creativity and art look like? My guests today, Heidi Rosenfelder and Jamie Woolf, can paint that picture for us, as each spent a significant portion of their career at Pixar Animation Studios, where Heidi was the leader of Pixar's leadership development team, and Jamie was the director of culture and learning. Working alongside Pixar's co-founder, the great Ed Catmull, they were part of a team that defied convention, embraced creativity in the broadest sense of the word, designed innovative programs that incorporated painting, drawing, improv, and other creative modalities, and continuously maintained and nurtured one of the most admired workplace cultures in the world, a culture that many regard as the key ingredient to the success of Pixar's films. So about a year ago, Heidi and Jamie decided it was time to spread their wings. So they left Pixar and co-founded Creativity Partners, where they build on everything they learned at Pixar, as well as at a host of other companies they've worked with throughout their careers, to help companies achieve their strategic goals by building healthier cultures. Whether asking executives to ditch their PowerPoints in favor of acting out their strategic plans, implementing programs such as painting with chocolate, using storytelling to uncover values and increase belonging, or reevaluating workplace policies through a more innovative lens, Heidi and Jamie are passionate about reimagining our workplaces and bringing back some of that joy we're all craving, but that's too often extracted out in the name of productivity and efficiency. And they make a compelling case that these creative cultures are both good for business and good for humanity. So lots of fun things to talk about today. So let's get to it. Heidi, Jamie, thank you so much for joining me today.
We are so excited to be here, Jessica.
Hi, Jessica. Really happy to be here as well.
Okay, so both of you are passionate about creating healthy, creative workplace cultures that inspire and engage talent. Can each of you share where that passion came from? Jamie, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I would say it comes from my mom, my childhood. And I had the good fortune of being raised by a single mom who was a school teacher and wildly creative. Our house was constantly filled with craft activities, and she would drag me to museums, and she had a cadre of school teacher friends who would come over and look through art books or do batiking or tie-dyeing. We were always doing something creative. And the house was also filled with art that was collected from all over the world. And so I just feel like that's core to who I am. And there's just something that was sparked in engaging in art. And so when I went to school, my mom was always diagnosing the quality of my teachers by their level of creativity. And unfortunately, growing up in Los Angeles unified schools, creativity was at a minimum, and there was a lot of rote learning and memorization. And my mom had me finally attuned to what wasn't working. Similarly, I felt as an only child privy to a lot of adult conversations about what wasn't working about their workplace, the schools, and that they weren't listened to. And they were professionals who were deprofessionalized, and there was a lot of burnout, and they were under-resourced. And when they would talk to their principal or try to get something from the administration, they were muted. And my mom started writing for the LA Times, and she had many articles in the LA Times about her views on education, and that was how she used her voice. But it was very disempowering, I would say, for these teachers. And so I think that's where I got my passion to both help people do work that's really fulfilling their full potential and infusing creativity into the workplace, whether it's schools or government or corporations or nonprofits.
You know, Jamie, when you're talking, I feel like your mother gave you a couple of gifts there. The creativity in your home, I think, is a real gift to give to your kids growing up. And also the self-advocacy that she taught you. Use your voice, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, Heidi, let's turn to you. What made you decide to focus your career on creating healthier workplace cultures?
I'd say creating workplaces where everyone gets to thrive has really been a driving purpose of my entire career. I started out as an employment lawyer and saw for many years how an unhealthy workplace culture can literally ruin people's lives. But I always felt that as a lawyer, my impact on the day-to-day work culture was quite limited. And so eventually I transitioned to executive coaching and consulting, which just felt like a much more direct way to influence culture. And so after being on my own and consulting with many different organizations, I was lucky to go in-house at Pixar as part of the leadership development team. And so over my 7+ years at Pixar, I learned so much about what's required to build a culture that really engages everyone. And that experience just enhanced my determination that that's the way to make work life better for organizations.
You know, it's funny, I've talked to several former employment lawyers who ended up getting involved in coaching in workplace culture because they had this epiphany of, oh, that's why these things happen. And they become very interested in preventing some of these messy conflicts from happening in the first place and just generally improving people's lives at work, which I think is just great. So what was the impetus for you forming Creativity Partners?
Well, we had a blast at Pixar, the two of us together. But at some point after nearly a decade, Jamie, a little more than a decade, it felt like, is this what we want to do for the rest of our career? And we were thinking, well, we have more in us. So the next 10 years, why don't we create our own work culture and bring what we know and have learned over our career to many different organizations, very much building, though, on what we learned at Pixar. We were just feeling ready for a new adventure. And so that's what was the initial thought. And then we went back and forth many times, and in the end, just took the leap.
Jamie, do you want to add anything?
I'll only add that my career trajectory was working in corporations. I started at Levi Strauss doing organizational development work, and then I had some jobs in financial institutions, moved to UC Berkeley, and then I moved to freelance consulting before going to Pixar. So I also love being an entrepreneur, and when I was talking with Pixar, I was very resistant to going inside again. I like being my own boss. I like executing on my own vision. But Pixar was just irresistible, working with Ed Catmull and the various brilliant creative people that I partnered with. And I could be very entrepreneurial within Pixar. But after 12 years, it gets to a point where, you want to spread your wings. And we wanted Heidi and I to execute on our own vision. And so as hard as it was to leave a wonderful place like Pixar, it's really been great.
If Ed Catmull was telling me that he wanted me to come and work for him, it was probably hard to resist, right? I have so much respect for him, and we'll talk more about him later in his wonderful book, Creativity Inc., which Heidi introduced me to and is actually one of my favorite books of all time. Okay, so conversations about workplace culture are pretty ubiquitous these days, and there are a variety of definitions that people use for culture. The definition that I gravitate towards, and that I think is used most often, comes from the late Peter Drucker, who says that your culture is the way people think, act, and interact with each other, on teams, and with your customers and partners. Jamie, I'm going to ask you, is this how you define it, or is there anything that you would change or add to this definition?
I also love this definition. I think it's all-encompassing. However, I think culture has become such a fad. We have to have a healthy culture. And what that translates to oftentimes is we need to have a culture where we are executing on our unique values, but the values are just slogans. They're just words. And so I really like to emphasize culture as the daily behaviors that translate these abstract visions and abstract values into how we behave, what decisions we make, how we allocate resources. But it really is all about behavior in my mind.
One thing I love that Jamie and I heard Jenny Chapman from the Haas Business School say, and I don't know whether she coined the phrase, but she always says culture is your strategy execution tool. And so building on what Jamie said, unless you're doing something, culture is meaningless. Culture won't help unless it's really strategically relevant to what you're doing. And the other thing that I like what she says is that really everyone has to uphold the culture, even when it's hard, when it's not absolutely necessary, and when no one is looking. I love those 3 points as add-ons to the Drucker definition.
Yeah, and I think implicit in what you're saying is it's not just top down, right? It's every direction.
Yeah, and all the time, right?
Yeah. On the Creativity Partners website, you articulate your value proposition. You say it is to make healthy workplace culture your competitive advantage. Why is it so important for businesses to actively and deliberately address their culture? And what are the business benefits of a healthy culture?
There's a truckload of research on this, but if you boil it all down, strong cultures connect with 4 times, 3 times, 5 times increase in revenue growth. And if you look at the 100 best companies to work for list, you also see a higher average annual return, as high as 400, 500% instead of 170% or 156% on S&P 500. So there's a strong correlation with organizations where the employees and the leaders would say it's a healthy culture, it's a good culture, they feel aligned with their culture, and the annual returns.
And what are the drawbacks of a weak or broken culture?
Broken cultures yield declining customer satisfaction, botched projects, poor decision-making, lack of innovation, employee turnover, and it's really hard to attract new talent if your culture is in trouble. And ultimately, you have a declining public reputation. Also, it's really important to understand why your culture is in trouble, to really investigate that. If we don't actively pay attention to what is working and not working in our organization, we end up with what we like to call fragile teams. And fragile teams really are not able to work at their full potential. They're not able to solve problems effectively and efficiently, and they're not able to innovate and be creative.
That term you use, fragile teams, I've never heard that before, but it really piques my curiosity. Can you explain what you mean by fragile teams and describe some of their defining characteristics?
A hallmark of fragile teams is fear. When people are afraid to make mistakes or they don't feel safe to show work that's still in progress, they're afraid to speak up with new ideas or when things don't work well, then teams are fragile. And so that's what we do at Creativity Partners. We designed an assessment that diagnoses where teams are broken, and we think about it in 6 dimensions. We start out with leadership, which is so important for setting the tone for safety and trust. Second is belonging, making sure all voices are heard and valued. Then learning, are we open to rethinking, experimentation, and feedback? collaboration? Are we tackling problems together, or do we work in silos? Then we go to accountability. Do we assume responsibility? And then finally, resilience. Do we allow time for replenishment and flow? But each of these 6 dimensions is really kind of a distinct facet or angle through which we look at culture. And metaphorically speaking, the 6 dimensions are really like the facets of a color prism, where each facet reflects light, and in synergy with each other, they create this beautiful kaleidoscope. But if one or more of these facets are broken, there cannot be synergy in the system, and that's what we then call fragile teams. And we then help leaders of teams to find the right intervention. How can we make this a safe team that works at its full potential?
Cigna did a study recently, the bottom line of having a culture where people are disengaged, there's absenteeism, low productivity, is 406 billion. I don't know how they calculated that, but we were at a conference about culture recently, and all of these academics were presenting slide after slide of really compelling data. But what was really not talked about much was, okay, so now if we know that this connection is problematic, weak culture, low revenue, and so forth, how do we rectify that? And so that's where we feel so much passion for the work that we do, because there's so many things you can do to turn that around, but we can't just stop at there's disconnection at work, or there's weak cultures, or people don't know what the values are. Like, what are we going to do about it?
Okay, so let's dive into that. Let's talk about what we can do about it and the important role that creativity can play. And I guess I should start by asking you how you define creativity. So when you talk about creativity and cultivating a creative workplace culture, what do you mean?
Well, we think of creativity as simply solving problems, and we get that from Ed Catmull. So, here he was the founder, leader of a creative company, but we don't want to make creativity some rarefied, nice to have luxury. Creativity is used when we're simply solving problems. So we want to define creativity in a broad sense, in a sense where people feel that it's accessible to them, that they truly are creative.
Yeah, and there has been a lot of research into the term creativity. And like Jamie said, the simpler the better in terms of problem solving as the definition. I think the literature talks about defining creativity as a group of individuals working together to produce novel and useful ideas that improve effectiveness. That's one of the definitions out there. Again, I like what Jenny Chapman at the Haas School of Business is saying. She says the most important predictor of creativity is the development of norms that support the expression of creative ideas in organizations. So she really nicely links creativity and culture. And that's part of our focus as well of our company, to really highlight how creativity is a necessity for culture.
Yeah, I really like the way she articulates that. And her reference to norms makes me think about the behavioral aspect of culture that you emphasized earlier. What are the acceptable behaviors that support or don't support creative ideas, creative thinking? What do you find are the biggest barriers to creativity in the workplace?
The biggest barrier we see is this over-indexing on efficiency, productivity. And so there's this notion when we talk about creativity that it's fluff or it's a nice to have. And we'll get pushback saying, we just don't have time. And yet their presenting problem is, we need to be best in class. We need to be competitive. We need to find original solutions to vexing problems.
Right. So for whatever reason, they're not connecting the dots between creativity and what they're trying to do. And perhaps that's because creativity has not traditionally been part of that conversation.
And just building on what Jamie is just saying on over-indexing on efficiency, that creates a level of fear in organizations, and there's no safety to experiment because that will cost time in people's minds. But what we see is that when we make it safe to experiment and make mistakes and share messy work, over time, creativity will flourish again in a much different way that actually serves efficiency.
Okay, so let's talk about Pixar, which is widely admired because of its long list of beloved animated films, of course. The Toy Story trilogy, The Incredibles, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, Coco, to name a few, but also because of its groundbreaking creative culture, which derives from the philosophies of Ed Catmull. So Heidi, turning to you first, from an insider's perspective, what do you think is the essential ingredient that makes Pixar's culture so special and that has contributed to its many successes?
The best way that I can think of is to talk about our values process, the way we unearthed values at Pixar. And Ed was always kind of allergic to formalizing values. And then Jamie and I together, and under the leadership of Catherine Serafian, came up with this process. I think it was actually originally, Jamie, it was your idea to collect stories throughout the studio of what it means to be here. What is a moment in time that inspires you to work here? And so we collected all these stories, 170 of them throughout the studio, and then distilled the values from the stories. And what became really clear was stories poured in about the purpose of our work, why we make these films, and all the special moments and the impact of them. So when Coco was released, there were lots of stories around Coco. Not only was it politically such a timely film because of all the insanity that was going on in terms of immigration, it was also profoundly moving and important for Hispanic filmmakers and audiences to see themselves represented on the screen. So there were lots of those stories. Other stories had to do with the impact of our films on children who were dying of cancer, and other heart-wrenching stories where people reached out to see an upcoming film or see the studio or meet a director. And so all these stories circled around the meaning of work, the purpose of it all. And it's an incredible motivator, and it inspires everyone who works at Pixar to give their very best. That kind of shared purpose defines the culture. And so, not surprising, community is one of our really important values at Pixar, and we link it with innovation, which is another value. So how can we live our purpose in this way became really clear through that values process. And so that's one way that I feel like Pixar's culture really contributes to its success. And it's such a precious asset, if we want to talk in asset terms. If we don't take care to maintain it, the success will be impacted. It's a very dangerous place if you stop paying attention to what makes a culture contribute to the success of the place.
One of the things that I was thinking about when you're talking is, I mean, you can't get more authentic than that, right? You don't try to make this value statement and then try to get everybody to fit into it. It's, what are we? Let's start from the ground up and hear what we are and what we mean to people, and then kind of figure it out from there. And that's a great example of the benefits of thinking creatively about how we do things. In this case, unearthing your values from the ground up through stories, rather than issuing some sort of edict about values that may or may not resonate with the people who work at the company.
If you ask most people, what are your company's values? A lot of people say, I don't know, or they'll say innovation or customer service. And then you say, so what does that look like? What does that mean in terms of how it dictates your behavior? And I would say 95% of the people will shrug and say, I don't know.
Right, and that disconnect can make those value statements feel pretty hollow. In that case, they're really just window dressing. So Jamie, is there anything about Pixar's culture that really stands out to you? Something that encapsulates the Pixar philosophy and you think has contributed in a particularly meaningful way to its success?
We did something called Notes Day. Pixar was at a crossroads facing growing competition and other challenges. So the leadership solicited ideas from all 1,200 employees. What did we need to fix to make Pixar thrive? About 4,000 ideas poured in, highlighting about 1,000 unique problems that we whittled down into about 120 topics. We trained internal facilitators to guide close to 200 small group conversations over the course of the day. And that opens up a big can of worms. Now you've got hundreds of problems that are brought to the surface. And if you don't do anything about them, then cynicism sets in. So it was a big risk. But the benefit in my mind was the elation people felt to have a hand in fixing the organization that they felt loyalty toward, so that there's that feeling of ownership for your company, that I was a part of building this, I was a part of shaping this. To me, that's belonging.
Absolutely. And I'm really struck by the humility of that. And humility is something that I don't feel we value enough in our workplaces and seems to really be embedded in Pixar's culture and Ed's kind of overarching philosophy that he sets out in Creativity Inc. He says, we start from the presumption that people are talented and want to contribute, and accept that without meaning to, we stifle talent in myriad unseen ways. And he goes on to talk about the importance of identifying these impediments and fixing them. And of course, Note Stay is a key way that Pixar does that. So that's a good segue into the work you do at Creativity Partners that really serves as the foundation for everything else. And that's your culture assessment. Can you tell us how you use the assessment to uncover those things that stifle creativity and talent within the organizations you work with?
So in our current work, we have an assessment with those 6 dimensions where we, in a different way, but similar to Note Stay, we're trying to unearth what gets in the way, what are the roadblocks to creativity and inspiration and innovation. And so I think what we learned at Pixar now is encapsulated in our assessment. But somewhere in Ed's book, he talks about fear in an organization and that it's a leader's job to find out what causes it, to understand it, and then find ways to fix it. And so our assessment directly links to that insight. He also says if there's more truth in the hallways, you're in trouble. And so again, we're really trying to figure out with our assessment that we created, based on lots of research in this field, how we can diagnose what's a roadblock in an organization's culture.
Do you find that the companies that you work with, when you do uncover something that is causing toxicity, for example, or someone that is causing toxicity, are the companies willing to actually hold those individuals accountable? What kind of reaction do you get when you say, this is a problem? Have you found that there's a willingness to address those things very authentically or to kind of brush them aside?
It's a great question, Jessica. And one of our 6 dimensions is leadership. So part of the assessment is about the leader of the team. And so what we've found so far, people or leaders who are willing to engage in this way, they're also willing to hold themselves accountable. We had one leader last year who got pretty tough feedback, and she did an incredible job. We helped her do it, but in front of her team to really acknowledge what had been going on with her, what she would like to do different, how she wants to be held accountable for what the survey showed. So far, we've had leaders who went through this assessment who were really motivated to be real about their own growth and being accountable to it.
And one of the 6 dimensions is accountability. So some of the questions are, is poor performance tolerated? Is poor attitude tolerated? And we learn an awful lot about an organization's culture and a team's performance by those 2 questions.
And those are such great direct questions. I think oftentimes the surveys that companies send out for feedback, the questions can be so vague that they don't really uncover the feedback that the companies probably need the most. Okay, so another thing you highlight on your website is storytelling, and you refer to the power of the story. And we've talked about storytelling a little bit already, but can you tell us more about how you use storytelling in the work you do and why it's so valuable?
I think being immersed in storytelling at Pixar has allowed us to help organizations tell their story, whether it's an individual leader, to help them activate an empowering narrative rather than the limiting stories that can hold us back, but also storytelling for a team, storytelling for a brand, storytelling that comes through or doesn't come through on clients' websites. So we see storytelling as a way to connect and deepen belonging. So that's one thing that we've found. A, there's an appetite for, and B, we have so much expertise now in the mechanics of a story. That story isn't just talking to one another. Story has an act 1, what's the current state? And act 2, what's the challenge? What are the obstacles? And act 3, even if we're not there yet, let's talk about our act 3, which is the learning, the victory, the resolution.
I love that you apply the storytelling framework that works so well in film in the Pixar movies and apply it in these other contexts. Okay, so Heidi, I know that one of your passions is coaching. Where does that fit into all of this?
Being a leader can be a very lonely place. So a big part of our work at Creativity Partners is also executive coaching, and that's certainly where my passion is. And I've learned so much at Pixar there too, in terms of coaching directors and producers and high-level leaders through the process of making these films. It's a grueling process with so many challenges, and leaders need a place where it's safe to just be open and raw and talk about what's hard and what is in their control and what's not in their control, and how they might use the wisdom of their body even to learn what they can do about things that are holding them back. And so coaching is a big part of, I want to say, maybe an intervention. Once we have the results of the assessments, coaching is often one of the tools that we use to help leaders, especially if they had gotten tough feedback.
So it's not like you do this assessment one and done and then you're out. You continue and have this ongoing relationship and help move the company forward.
I love that you just mentioned that, because we would have been so remiss not to say it. We really have a strong belief that working with Creativity Partners is not just an event. If it's just a flash in the pan, it's not going to do very much. So that's why it's really important to then create an experience where people co-create agreements on the team based on the assessment results, and real agreements that have meaning. So here's what we're going to do as a team to address these challenges that we saw through this assessment. And then we check in with them. That's part of the process. How are we measuring the forward movement? And then we'll check in with them in the next few months. And similarly for the leader, they can choose to do executive coaching in this framework of measuring, learning, changing. And then as we keep going with this experience, we revise the agreements with the team. We co-create new agreements with the team just to keep it all going.
And that's where so often the ball gets dropped. Companies ask for feedback, and then when employees don't see any action being taken to address the problems, they can become very cynical. So these agreements show that the company or the leader is willing to act on the feedback provided, which is so important. Another aspect of your coaching that you refer to on your website is leading hybrid teams. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about some of the challenges companies are facing today as a result of the transition to more hybrid work. Heidi, one of your roles at Pixar was to help the studio transition from a fully on-site to a hybrid workplace. This is something, of course, many companies are struggling with decisions about how often employees should be required or encouraged to come into the office, with many workers desiring the flexibility that they got used to during the pandemic, but many workplace leaders worrying that permanent hybrid or remote working will negatively impact their culture by curtailing that sense of connection that's so important. So first of all, are those concerns warranted?
I think they are very much warranted. Connection is a challenge in the remote world and in the hybrid world, and we have to be very intentional to maintain connection if we're not all together in person. Historically, Pixar was a very in-person workplace. We thrive on being together, solving problems together. And when we all had to leave the building at the beginning of the pandemic, really our community, innovation, and ownership values kicked in a big way. It was really incredible that we were able to make and finish our films while fully remote. We had an incredible systems team that figured out what was needed, and everybody really stepped up to make this happen. The executive team quickly shifted to virtual studio meetings, and leadership development developed a 2.5-day leadership training on leading inclusively when we're all remote, and all of the 400 leaders participated in this fully virtual program.
And how did things change when you pivoted from fully remote to a hybrid model?
This hybrid situation is trickier than fully remote or fully in person. It was much harder to create community, and some of the biases that are common in hybrid workplaces started to play out. For example, proximity bias. People who are at the studio are perceived to get better treatment by their leaders. And it's not an intentional act on anybody's part, but that's what the perception becomes. So proximity bias is very real. So we started to offer trainings on how to lead hybrid teams to make sure all leaders were aware of the potential biases. And as part of this training, we helped leaders and teams to clarify their team norms. How are we running our meetings? How are we communicating? What's the communication frequency? And what are the agreements around schedule? And we provided a framework to really help them decide when in-person collaboration should be prioritized. And essentially, the framework distinguished the purpose and the participation of the task at hand. And so if the purpose was task-based, like getting something done by yourself, for example, animating a shot, remote work was possible. But if the purpose was relationship-based, then we recommended on-site, in-person as much as possible. And then we looked at participation needs, is a more passive situation or where remote work was okay, or was it something that really required a conversation? And so then we recommended on-site engagements. But I have to say that hybrid, I don't think it's figured out anywhere. It's hard. And the jury is still out on how to make hybrid really work.
Yeah, very challenging. And of course, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. But what I really like about the framework you mentioned is that there's a rationale, a purpose behind when it makes sense for people to be in the office, and a recognition that, as we learned during the pandemic, that's not always necessary.
And not to forget that hybrid and flexibility, has such advantages for working parents, for all kinds of situations where people can actually give more of themselves if they have flexibility. So it's on us as an organization, as a leader, to figure out how can we make this happen so that the culture doesn't lose out and the individual benefits.
And what you're describing lies in stark contrast to those across-the-board mandates that we hear so much about and that are often perceived as being primarily about compliance and control. And I actually just saw a LinkedIn post by organizational psychologist Adam Grant, and he references a 4-year study of S&P 500 companies, apparently showing that when firms required people to come into the office, profits did not climb, and job satisfaction and work-life balance actually fell. So is there any advice that you can provide to workplace leaders who may be struggling with what they perceive as a tension between flexibility and culture?
To begin with, listen to what your team needs. Come at it with a curiosity mindset and really have a conversation with the team and one-on-one without preconceived notions of how it should be. Building trust when exploring hybrid options is really important. Start from a place of honest curiosity. What do you need to do your best work? What agreements do we need so everyone can do their best work? Start with curiosity and then co-create your team's hybrid playbook.
One of the things I've seen some companies do to strike a balance is to be more creative about what it means to come into the office and injecting some more flexibility into that. So for example, maybe coming into the office doesn't always have to mean being in the office from 9 to 6 or 7 or whatever. Maybe we can be more thoughtful about scheduling so that if you're working on a project that requires in-person collaboration, you do that at the beginning of the day so that parents can leave and go pick up their kids, for example, and then do their more task-based work from home after that.
I couldn't agree more, Jessica. And again, it starts with just curiosity. What do you need to give us your best?
One of the biggest complaints that I hear from employees post-pandemic is my employer wants me to come into the office, but then I come in and I'm sitting at my desk all day. And I think since the pandemic, when it became clear that with all the advances in technology, it's very possible to work efficiently and effectively from our homes, people are looking for employers to give them a reason to come into the office, to make it worthwhile, to make it meaningful for them. And one of the ways that you have always done that, both pre- and post-pandemic at Pixar, and in your current work with Creativity Partners, is through art and incorporating things like painting, drawing, working with clay, and improv into the workplace. So I want to spend some time talking about that. So Jamie, you introduced me to a book on our pre-call called Your Brain on Art, written by Susan Maximum and Ivy Ross, that addresses the growing field of neuroaesthetics and the value of what the authors call having an aesthetic mindset. And that book makes a very strong case that for the benefit of society, really, art should be part of each of our worlds, which many of us know intuitively, But understanding how art affects our brains, I found that so interesting. And there are so many implications for the fields of medicine and architecture and education, and of course, the world of work. Jamie, can you share some of your favorite insights from that book? And then I'd also like to talk about how we can use this information to enrich our workplaces.
Yeah, so the book rocked my world because, as I said, I grew up with art. I have a passion for infusing art into my kids' lives as a parent, but then professionally, Heidi and I have a passion for bringing it into the workplace. And this book was the validation of everything we knew intuitively. We saw it in people's eyes, in the energy shifts, but here's the data now. And Susan, who is a researcher at Johns Hopkins, writes about groundbreaking research that shows how neural pathways in our brain open up when we engage in art. And the research shows that if you engage in art for 45 minutes a day, the health effects are significant. And I would say doing 5 minutes a day, you could see the well-being effects. People are in a better mood. And there's something in the book that I found maybe most profound, even beyond the health effects, is that art is the essence of awareness. And I think that we can walk around so deadened to the world around us. And it heightens our senses. It allows us to see differently, to notice things we've never noticed before. In our neighborhoods, in our partners, in our kids, this aesthetic mindset is so beautiful and so powerful.
And of course, that ability to see things differently is also so critical to innovation. So when you run programs that are grounded in art, and when, as the research shows, the neural pathways are opening up, what does that look like?
We see how people come to some of our workshops, they're hurrying in, maybe they had a stressful meeting just beforehand, and you can see them attached to their phone, and then you ground them in something creative. Their brains literally are ready for learning, and they were not beforehand.
Something that really got my attention in the book was the discussion of the impact of the physical space in which we work, and how architects and others are using neuroaesthetics research to create enriched environments that help us to be healthier and more in sync with our surroundings, using more natural light, for example.
Thinking about Pixar again, space was so important in our culture there, and what the work environment looked like. So if you've ever been to Pixar, this big atrium in the middle really brings people together. And it's a space that you just want to talk and create and be there together. And then we have offices that people are just creating their own spaces. Somebody had created an office as a taco truck, or somebody had a caveman theme going. And I mean, people thrive differently in physical spaces. So creating that individual space might look different for different organizations. Maybe in law firms, you won't have caveman offices or taco trucks, but there is a way to create or bring in individuality of a person into their office. And I think the world of the cubicles are really going away because people know how deadening that experience can be.
Yeah, and in this era of open floor plans and hot desks, when many people don't even have individual offices anymore, are there things that employers can do to make the physical space more inviting to people?
It's imperative that people are able to connect with others when they come in. So creating spaces that invite collaboration and connection is super important. If that does not exist, it makes it even harder for people to want to come in, especially if they have a punishing commute.
Do creativity and art have a role to play in addressing some of the issues we're collectively struggling with more broadly as a society? Issues like loneliness and lack of connection?
Well, I had the good fortune to spend the day with the likes of Vivek Murthy, our U.S. Surgeon General, who's talked about loneliness as an epidemic and that we need to bring creativity into healthcare, government, workplaces, schools. And the day was spent with cellists, dancers, authors, luminaries in the world of creativity. And what was also a theme was that with AI, now more than ever, we need to amplify creativity because machines can do the rest.
Because we've come through the pandemic and we've been so remote and disconnected from each other, creative collaboration becomes harder sometimes. And so one of our dear colleagues, Adam Rosenthal from Late Night Art, talks about the disease of disconnection, and that the arts in particular help us feel connected to each other. And once we feel that connection, we're more open to creative thought, whatever the problem is that we're solving. And so it's a way into effective collaboration to use creativity and the arts.
You know, Heidi, as you were talking, I was thinking about how during the pandemic, when we were on lockdown, creativity was coming out of the woodwork. It was everywhere. People were sharing YouTube videos of dance and music. I remember there were these dancers, Misty Copeland and others, who came together virtually from all over the world and did a version of Swan Lake for COVID relief. And it was edited together as one continuous dance, even though they were scattered across the globe. And it was so powerful, so moving. And I watched it every day during the pandemic. And it just made me feel so much more connected to the rest of the world.
I mean, I love what you just said. We crave creativity. It's so basic to our humanity, how we connect, how we see the world. And I think now that we're post-pandemic, we still have this over-indexing on efficiency and productivity. And in the meantime, we see so many workplaces where the joy is extracted out. And then when we bring in creative modalities like drawing, like music, like theater, you just see this childlike wonder come over people's faces and the energy shifts. And it's powerful. It's magic.
And of course, providing opportunities for people to participate in art can boost engagement, thereby increasing productivity and efficiency. But I think there are many of us who crave creativity and who would be thrilled to work somewhere that really valued not only creative thinking, but creative doing and artistic expression as you describe. But outside of the Pixars of the world, are workplace leaders really open to incorporating these creative modalities into their workplaces? Because I can certainly think of some people I've worked with in the past who, well, I just don't know that I can see them participating in these activities.
It's so striking. At first, top leaders have this instinct, oh, that's wasteful. We don't have time for painting and all that. And then when you engage people in this way, you notice even the top leaders open up their minds and their brains to a deeper thinking. And then finally they get it. And so we've seen it over and over again in the last year with people you wouldn't think that they are open to this, like, data engineers and scientists and pharma industry executives. And it was so rewarding to see their brains open through the work we did with them.
I have a story from a huge tech company where we were working with data scientists, and we talked to the leader when we were scoping out the work, who was very skeptical about bringing painting in, saying, these are a bunch of introvert PhD computer scientists. I don't think they're going to really take to this. Well, it was quite the opposite. And I remember one man who was very quiet, very introverted, and we had them on canvases drawing their vision that they had discussed during the day of the future of their department. And he was lit up, his eyes were big, he was smiling, he was laughing. And he came over to me afterward and he said, I want to engage with my grandchild in art because he's always bringing home art projects. And now I want to find that connection with my grandchild.
That's lovely. And I'm smiling because I have a friend who is a photographer and painter, and he paints regularly with his granddaughter. And he has shown me some photographs of the two of them together, co-creating. And the connection between them, the joy they're experiencing, it's so readily apparent when you look at these photographs. And something I often talk about is how the experiences we have at work carry over into the rest of our lives, impacting how we show up for our families, our partners, our communities. And so often that conversation is related to something negative going on, an abusive boss, a toxic work environment. But that's such a wonderful example of something positive carrying over. So I really, really love that example. And what are some other ways that our workplaces can ignite our individual and collective creativity?
At Pixar, it was so important to have Pixar University, which brought unbelievably inspiring classes to the organization and opened up their creative thinking. And it's a hugely valued part of Pixar.
Yes, of course. And Jamie, you led Pixar University. So can you tell us a bit about it?
Pixar University is three things. One is technical training, one is art and film education, and one is leadership development. And in the art and film realm, we had painting with chocolate, drawing donuts, improv, guitar, ukulele. And some organizations might say, well, that's because you have to nurture the creatives at a place like Pixar. But what Ed Catmull said is it's not so much what the class even is. He used to say it could be underwater basket weaving, but the connections that were built in those classes when people were drawing together or doing clay together, those connections were enduring, memorable, and deep.
And since you left Pixar, are you finding that other types of organizations are open to exploring some of these creative ways of doing things, incorporating painting or working with clay, or using storytelling in different ways? Do they have an appetite for that?
Absolutely. Even organizations that would say they're not creative have a huge appetite for creativity.
Recently, we brought some of the kind of film modalities, Act 1, 2, and 3, which is part of every film creation. We brought that storytelling tool into an organization, and people just lit up by creating a script for what their strategic vision was and breaking it down into those 3 acts. And then on top of that, not only writing the script, but also acting it out in front of everybody. And this is now a year ago, and people are still talking about that experience in this organization and how they know about each other's strategic plans because they heard the script and they saw it played out. I bet you if they had just read out some kind of report, it wouldn't have had the same impact.
They wouldn't even remember it, probably. And we talked earlier about adapting to the hybrid work environment and the desire for more connection and more meaning from our in-office experiences. And It would seem to me that these kinds of things that get people connecting physically through improv, through drawing, through co-creation, I would just think that at this time in particular, these things would really resonate with people and are just so, so valuable.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk big picture. You launched Creativity Partners about a year ago during a period that was, and of course times continue to be, characterized by uncertainty and disruption. Companies are grappling with inflation and supply chain issues. They're focused on cutting costs. Generative AI has come of age. There are geopolitical disruptions. There's a mental health crisis. The list goes on. Based on your experience, what factors determine whether a company is able to successfully adapt in the midst of these ongoing disruptions? And where does creativity come into play? Jamie, why don't we start with you?
It's important that organizations think really expansively, to be imaginative. Adam Grant popularized an activity, and I don't remember who originated it, but the kill your company activity. What if we just take it down to the studs? And what are the sacred cows that we need to discard, and how do we rethink the very business that we're in? One of the things about AI is we have massive amounts of data available. And so with the data being predictive of some of the things that we need to provide in different ways, the organizations that can think beyond incremental change, that can really introduce long-term, bigger bets, breakthroughs, those are the organizations that will thrive, and organizations that we've seen thrive. If you look back on history and some of the companies like Kodak or Blockbuster that didn't do that. And then on the flip side, there's Levi Strauss, who saw an opportunity with apparel when everybody else was focused on striking it rich with gold. In a time of turbulent change, figuring out where the opportunities are requires creative thinking. We believe that the organizations that are most adaptable and will thrive in the future are curious, are listening to their customers, are listening to their people, are thinking in imaginative ways. Creativity is about originality, so they're coming up with original ideas that are not what everybody else is doing.
That's spot on, Jamie. I think the film industry is also a good example. It's changing so drastically, and only the studios that are really willing to look at, okay, kind of in the kill the company framework that Jamie mentioned, how can we start fresh, do it all new, rather than being stuck in this is how we've always been doing it, here is how we're making our films. And so it'll be that kind of curiosity and willingness to take a risk is going to make or break these studios.
And getting outside of their lane and dialoguing with organizations outside of their industry. So one of the things we did at Pixar is we brought a pharma company in, and we had leaders at Pixar talking to leaders of this pharma company. And it was so mind-opening to hear, wow, they have some of the very same problems in a very different industry, or they've thought of things that we simply don't think about because we're inside this industry and kind of an echo chamber. So step out of the walls of your industry and dialogue with companies very different than your own.
I completely agree. And I think a great tool for addressing resistance to change within an industry can be to highlight examples of different ways of doing things from other industries that are effective, that have been successful. So for years, people have been talking about the future of work. And I think it's here. I think the future of work has arrived. But there will certainly be many more disruptions and many more opportunities in the coming months and years. Before we close out, I'd like to ask each of you to share your top advice for any workplace leaders who are listening and who want to cultivate healthy, creative workplace cultures that can adapt to whatever these disruptions are that lie ahead. And while I think it's implicit in that, but I want to highlight it, where people feel safe to make the mistakes that inevitably come when you're trying to innovate, and to bring their full selves to work and use their unique experiences to problem solve, to be creative. Heidi, why don't we start with you?
Well, it's interesting because we were at a conference, as Jamie mentioned earlier. They put up a question that for everybody, it was 170 people, leaders in the room. And they asked, what is one word to describe what you think is the key ingredient for a positive and healthy workplace culture? And so everybody put up their word in the software that they used. And trust beat out everything else by far. It's the most mentioned word, most important ingredient. And so I agree with that. We talked a lot about connection already, which would be my second key ingredient, and how to create that and how to maintain it. But trust really is on leaders to figure out, what do I need to do to be trustworthy? Trust goes in two directions, right? Where can I share more? How can I be more transparent? And then the other direction, what do I need to do to show that I trust those I lead? How can I make it safe to innovate and experiment? How can I foster learning for all? And for leaders to really be honest with themselves. Where do my words not match what my actions are? Where am I not walking the talk, so to speak? Trust is so easily broken and really hard to gain back.
That's great advice. Jamie, what about you?
Well, both Heidi and I have kids in their 20s. I think we need to talk to them, listen to what the millennials, the Gen Z folks feel about work. They feel very differently about work than we do. And so the common ingredient we're talking about is being curious and listening. And so listening to people in younger generations, listening to all of our stakeholders, dialoguing cross-industry, dialoguing with employees so that we're co-creating the future. We're not doing this in isolation. And then I think the second thing is to bring art and creativity into the workplace, because it's where we spend most of our time and it's where we really get in touch with humanity.
Right. And in the age of AI, those uniquely human attributes like empathy, compassion, collaboration, relationship building, all things that can be cultivated through creative expression and the arts, and through activities that you've so clearly demonstrated can be incorporated into our workplaces, are so critical. And that leads really nicely into a passage from your Brain on Art that I'd like to read here. It says, what the arts do to our brains and bodies allows us to give voice to important messages, reveal our emotions, drive innovation, spark creativity, raise ethical and moral issues, and shepherd in new eras of humanity.
This is music to my ears. I love that.
What a beautiful way to end this conversation.
So on that note, Heidi, Jamie, we're out of time. But before I let you go, are there any resources you'd like to tell our listeners about? And how can they find out more about everything we've talked about today?
Our website is a good start, creativity-partners.com. We mentioned a lot of different books today. So, Creativity Inc. is in its second edition, Your Brain on Art. In terms of the listening piece and how you interact with the people on your team and really find out what's working and not working, really like Adam Grant's Think Again book. And then Work Rules by Laszlo Bock has a lot of good stuff in it too. There's so many good books out there, but we invite anybody who wants to learn more about our assessment to book some time through our website, and we'll tell you more about those 6 facets of our assessment and how it might work for your organization or your team.
We just like talking with people. I mean, we truly love having conversations that are not about selling us, but we're on a constant listening tour to understand what happens inside diverse workplaces. So reach out and have a conversation with us.
Well, Jamie, Heidi, thank you for having this conversation with me. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for sharing so many great ideas and strategies for bringing more creativity, more art, and more joy into our workplaces.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you.
That is it for this episode of Reimagining the Workplace. I'm Jessica Cherry. Thank you so much for listening.